Welcome to Sleepy Crime, where the night is long, the rain is steady, and the darkest stories unfold in whispers. Tonight, we quiet the noise of the highways and drift into the shadows of the Pacific Northwest in the early 1980s. A place of gray skies, steady rain, and forests so dense they seem to swallow sound. Along the banks of the Green River near Seattle, the world feels muted, hushed as if secrets sink easily into the damp earth. Young women began to vanish. Some were runaways. Some were sex workers. Some were simply trying to survive from one night to the next. Their disappearances rarely made headlines. But soon bodies surfaced from the water, and the woods silent signs that something patient and deliberate was moving through the region. For years, the killings seemed unconnected. Different locations, different victims, no clear pattern the public could recognize. The murderer didn't write letters. He didn't taunt the police. He waited. He'd blended into routine, into factories and family dinners, into church pews and break rooms. He looked like everyone else. The newspapers would eventually give him a name, the Green River Killer. A quiet man living an ordinary life, while leaving behind one of the largest collections of victims in American history. So let the rain fall. Let the river carry its secrets downstream. And settle in, as we begin the haunting story of Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. Long before the Green River carried bodies instead of reflections, Gary Leon Ridgway was just another quiet boy in a working-class household, growing up in the damp gray margins of the Pacific Northwest. He was born in 1949 in Salt Lake City, but it was Washington State that would shape him with its constant drizzle, its heavy skies, and its sense that things could disappear easily into trees or water and never truly be seen again. Ridgway's childhood was not one of dramatic violence or obvious cruelty at first glance. There were no sensational headlines, no visible warning signs that leapt out in hindsight. Instead, there was something far more subtle and far more dangerous, a suffocating normality wrapped around a deeply disturbed inner world. Gary grew up in a house ruled quietly but firmly by his mother, Mary Rita Ridgway, a woman whose presence would loom large over his psychology for decades to come. She was obsessed with cleanliness, especially sexual cleanliness, scrubbing Gary's body when he was already far too old for such intimacy, lecturing him endlessly about sin, dirt, and moral decay. These rituals were framed as care, but they carried an undercurrent of shame that sank deep into them. At the same time, she berated him constantly, belittling his intelligence, his masculinity, his usefulness. Gary would later say that he both loved and hated his mother, that he feared her judgment even while craving her approval. This emotional contradiction never resolved itself. Instead, it hardened into something twisted, a knot of resentment and dependency that colored every relationship he would later have with women. At school, Ridgway did not stand out. He struggled academically, reading slowly, processing information with difficulty. Teachers described him as dull, obedient, forgettable. Other children bullied him for his awkwardness and his inability to defend himself. But Gary learned early how to vanish into compliance. He didn't fight back. He didn't complain. He absorbed humiliation quietly, storing it somewhere internal, where it fermented over time rather than dissipated. This was the earliest version of a pattern that would define him for life. Endure, 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 and then release everything in secret, where no one could correct or interrupt him. As a teenager, his isolation deepened. He had no close friends and no sense of belonging beyond the home he felt trapped inside. Sexuality confused and angered him, in large part because it had been framed as something dirty and dangerous from such an early age. Rather than learning healthy intimacy, Gary developed a mix of fascination and disgust toward women. He was aroused by them, but also enraged by his own desire, as though every attraction was proof of weakness. His fantasies began to grow darker, feeding on humiliation and control, though they remained internal, invisible to those around him. One incident from his adolescence stands out with an almost chilling clarity. Ridgway later confessed that as a teenage boy, he stabbed a young boy with a knife. The attack was sudden, violent, and completely out of character with the image he presented outwardly. The boy survived, and for reasons that remain unclear, the incident never resulted in meaningful consequences. It was treated as a confusing and isolated act, not a warning sign. But for Gary, it was proof of something important. Violence could erupt from within him, and the world might still carry on as if nothing had happened. This lesson would not be forgotten. By the time he entered adulthood, Ridgway had learned how to construct a mask so convincing that he would wear it for decades. He joined the Navy briefly, though his service was unremarkable. He returned to Washington and settled into the kind of life that rarely attracts scrutiny. He worked manual labor jobs, including at a Kenworth truck factory, a place defined by routine, predictability, and minimal social expectation. He showed up on time. He followed instructions. He blended into the background of machinery noise and fluorescent light. To supervisors and co-workers, he was disarmingly ordinary, hard-working, quiet, polite. He did not drink excessively, did not boast, did not misbehave. He lived the kind of life that society assumes is safe simply because it is boring. Gary married multiple times, though none of the relationships were healthy or stable. His wives described him as emotionally distant, sexually demanding, and deeply uncomfortable with intimacy unless it occurred strictly on his terms. Sex, for Ridgway, was not about connection or pleasure shared. It was about release and control, about momentary relief from the pressure constantly building inside him. This dynamic mirrored his relationship with his mother, dependence mixed with resentment, closeness poisoned by shame. Marriage did not stabilize him. It merely provided structure, another layer of normal life that allowed him to continue hiding in plain sight. Religion entered Ridgway's life during this period, but not as a source of moral reflection. Instead, it became another tool of compartmentalization. He attended church, spoke of faith, even prayed for forgiveness, not because he planned to stop doing wrong, but because confession helped him feel temporarily cleansed, absolved enough to continue. In his mind, sin and absolution were part of a cycle. He later admitted that he would pray for God to make him stop killing even as he continued killing afterward. This wasn't hypocrisy in the conventional sense. It was emotional isolation taken to its extreme form, where belief did not restrain behavior, but simply coexisted with it, neatly separated into different mental rooms. The Pacific Northwest in the late 1970s and early 1980s provided the perfect environment for someone like Ridgway. The region was vast, green, and sparsely patrolled in many areas. Rivers cut through forests. Roads twisted through industrial zones and trailer parks. People moved constantly: loggers, factory workers, transients, sex workers, runaways. Disappearances were easy to explain away. A woman who vanished near a highway might have hitchhiked somewhere else. A runaway might have started a new life. A sex worker might have simply moved to another corner. Society did not look closely, and law enforcement resources were stretched thin. Ridgway noticed this long before anyone noticed him. He began frequenting areas where vulnerable women gathered, especially along Pacific Highway South. He posed as a client, blending into the familiar pattern of men who came and went from those spaces. His demeanor was calm, predictable, non-threatening. Women who encountered him would later describe him as quiet but polite, not unlike dozens of other men they met each week. Nothing about him screamed danger. This anonymity was not accidental, it was cultivated. Ridgway understood instinctively that predators who announce themselves fail. The ones who survive are the ones who look forgettable. It was during this period that the inner pressure he had carried since childhood finally found its outlet. The resentments, the shame, the humiliation, the fascination with control. All of it converged into action. Ridgway's first known murder occurred in 1982, when he strangled a young woman named Wendy Cafu. It was not dramatic. It was not explosive. It was quiet, methodical, and intimate in the most disturbing way. Strangulation requires proximity and patience. It demands that the killer remain present, watching the life leave another person's body. Ridgway found that this method satisfied something deep and internal, a need to dominate totally, to silence not just a voice but an existence. After killing, he felt no lasting guilt in the way most people understand it. There was fear of being caught, yes, concern about consequences, but remorse was fleeting at best. Instead, there was a sense of calm, as though an internal pressure valve had been released. This relief reinforced the behavior. Murder became, for Ridgway, a form of emotional regulation. When tension built, when resentment resurfaced, when humiliation stirred inside him, he returned to the same method, the same type of victim, the same quiet release. Crucially, Ridgway did not stop living his ordinary life after these early killings. He went to work the next day, clocked in, spoke to co-workers, attended family gatherings, prayed, ate dinner. Sleepy crime lives in moments like this, the contrast between catastrophic violence and banal routine. Ridgway's ability to compartmentalize allowed him to exist in two worlds that never touched. To the outside, he was a factory worker with grease under his nails and a schedule written in pencil on a fridge. To his victims, he was the last face they saw. As bodies began to surface near the Green River, fear rippled through the region, but Ridgway remained untouched by suspicion. Profiles of serial killers at the time focused on loners, drifters, visibly disturbed individuals. Ridgway was none of those things. He was married, employed, socially invisible. Even when questioned by police later, in the investigation, he passed polygraph tests and answered calmly, blending into the statistical noise of thousands of ordinary men. What made Ridgway uniquely effective as a killer during this phase was not brilliance or charisma. It was something far more unsettling: patience. He did not rush. He did not escalate dramatically. He learned from each act, refining his methods, choosing locations carefully, adjusting behaviors to reduce risk. This was not a predator driven by impulse alone. It was someone who viewed murder as a routine, almost procedural activity, something slotted between shifts and errands, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The stretch of road that would later come to define the Green River killings did not look different from any other industrial corridor in Washington state. Pacific Highway South ran like an artery through strip malls, motels with flickering neon signs, warehouses, car lots, and patches of overgrown land that felt forgotten by design. Trucks rumbled through at all hours, commuters passed without slowing, and at night the shadows grew long and indistinct beneath the steady drizzle. This was not a place people lingered unless they needed to, and for Gary Ridgway, that need became the center of his double life, a space where anonymity thrived and where he could move without being remembered. In the early 1980s, Pacific Highway South was a known hub for sex work. Women stood along the roadside, moving in and out of cars that slowed briefly before merging back into traffic. Some were teenagers, having run from abusive homes or foster systems that failed them. Others were older, weathered by years of survival on the margins. Many were addicted, scraping together money to get through the night. To the broader society, they were invisible, tolerated at best, dismissed at worst. What few realized was that this environment, shaped by neglect and structural indifference, offered exactly what a predator like Ridgway needed: access without accountability. Ridgway did not arrive at this corridor impulsively. He observed it. He studied its rhythms. He learned where police rarely patrolled, which corners stayed busy, which women rotated spots, and which disappeared without anyone asking too many questions. He blended in seamlessly among the steady flow of customers. He did not harass. He did not rush. He did not act aggressive. His calm demeanor was his camouflage. Women who entered his vehicle later told investigators that he seemed ordinary, quiet, even polite, sometimes awkward. He didn't talk much. He didn't bargain harshly. He presented himself as predictable, which in that world felt safer than kindness. The psychology at play here is crucial. Ridgway's victims were not random in the way many people imagine serial killers operate. They were selected based on vulnerability, not identity. Age, background, name, these details mattered little compared to circumstance. The women he targeted were those the system had already failed, those whose absence would be explained away with assumptions. He knew that if a woman vanished from Pacific Highway South, society would not rush to search rivers and forests for her. She would be categorized as transient, unstable, gone by choice. Ridgway understood this long before law enforcement publicly acknowledged it. For him, the highway corridor served multiple purposes. It was a hunting ground, but it was also a psychological buffer. Everything that happened there felt separate from his real life, from his job at the factory, from his marriages, from church services, and family dinners. Driving along Pacific Highway South allowed him to step into another version of himself without fully abandoning the first. He did not need to travel far. He did not need to cross state lines. The violence lived close to home, tucked into the corners society avoided looking at. The murders during this phase followed a chilling consistency. Ridgway typically strangled his victims, often inside his vehicle, or shortly after taking them to another location. Strangulation was not incidental, it was chosen. It allowed prolonged control, forced intimacy, and ensured silence. Later, he would move their bodies to secluded areas, riverbanks, wooded lots, ravines, places where water and foliage worked together to erase evidence. Sometimes he revisited these sites, returning not to mourn or regret, but to confirm his dominion over the places where he had ended lives. These visits were not necessary for concealment. They were ritual. What makes this period especially disturbing is how seamlessly Ridgway layered these killings into his routine. He often went to work the same day. He ate meals afterward. Sometimes he had sex with his wife shortly after killing another woman. The absence of emotional collision between these acts reveals a mind that had fully separated consequence from behavior. For Ridgway, violence did not disrupt daily life. It existed parallel to it, like a second job he clocked into when needed. Meanwhile, the region began to notice something was wrong. Bodies surfaced in or near the Green River. Remains were discovered in clusters that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. By 1983, the news started using terms like pattern and serial. Law enforcement formed task forces, conducted searches, and interviewed dozens of men who frequented Pacific Highway South. And yet, even as the net widened, Ridgway remained just another ordinary face moving through the area. He was questioned multiple times by police during the investigation. Each time, he answered calmly. He cooperated. He provided samples. He even took polygraph tests and passed them. The technology of the time was imperfect, But what truly worked in his favor was demeanor. Ridgway did not fit the popular narrative of a killer. He wasn't volatile. He wasn't theatrical. He didn't seek attention. He did not talk too much or too little. He existed comfortably in the gray zone where suspicion rarely attaches itself. The highway continued to claim victims. Families searched desperately, often dismissed or redirected by authorities who believed their daughters had simply left. Mothers and sisters posted flyers along streets that already felt hostile, hoping someone would remember a face among countless strangers. For every body discovered, several more women vanished without closure. The Green River Task Force faced mounting pressure, but resources were limited, leads contradictory, and public fear diffuse. There was no single suspect who rose above the background noise. Ridgway adapted as attention increased. When police began focusing heavily on the river itself, he shifted dumping sites. When patrols intensified, he paused temporarily or killed elsewhere. His behavior demonstrated restraint, not obsession. He could wait. He could stop and start again. This patience prolonged his freedom more effectively than luck ever could. Unlike impulsive offenders, Ridgway did not need constant escalation. His crimes filled a psychological need, not an urgent craving. That distinction allowed him to survive scrutiny. The corridor also acted as a space where society's moral hierarchy became painfully visible. While fear grew, it was selective fear. Middle-class communities worried, but many dismissed the danger as limited to those women. The language itself did damage. It suggested that some victims mattered less, that some losses were acceptable. This mindset slowed urgency and fractured public will. Ridgway benefited from this cultural blind spot. He was not just hiding from police, he was hiding inside collective indifference. As the body count increased, internal disagreements plagued the investigation. Different agencies focused on different suspects. Resources were spread thin across too many possibilities. Without DNA technology capable of linking cases definitively, evidence remained circumstantial. Witness descriptions were vague. The highway swallowed details as effectively as it swallowed people. Ridgway continued to work, pray, and occasionally kill, his life segmented into clean, manageable compartments. By the mid-1980s, the media pressure reached a peak. The Green River Killer had become a name, a rumor, a fear whispered among women who worked the streets. Some stopped hitching rides. Some moved away. Others could not afford to. Ridgway noticed the shift. He noticed when familiar faces vanished for reasons not related to him. He noticed when corners emptied. This awareness did not deter him. It forced him to refine. He began targeting women farther from the main stretch, sometimes luring them with offers of drugs or work. Sometimes he sought those too young or too desperate to recognize danger. Each adjustment extended the life of his pattern. This was not chaos, it was maintenance. Murder, for Ridgway, had become something like a controlled environment he managed carefully. Through it all, the highway remained what it had always been, a place people drove through without remembering details. The motels, the lots, the curves in the road never felt permanent. They were transitional spaces. And that transience allowed horror to repeat without imprinting itself too deeply on public consciousness. Where nothing feels rooted, nothing feels claimed. Ridgway exploited that emptiness fully. This corridor was not just a backdrop to his crimes, it was a collaborator. It offered anonymity, plausible explanations, and social cover. It absorbed violence the way asphalt absorbs rain, without showing stains beneath the headlights. And as long as it did, Gary Ridgway remained a ghost behind the wheel, a man driving past shoppers and commuters carrying his secrets in silence. When the first bodies were pulled from the Green River, the reaction was not immediate panic but confusion. Rivers carry debris. They carry branches, trash, sometimes animals. Death, at first, did not announce itself loudly. It emerged slowly, reluctantly, as though the river itself was unsure what it wanted to reveal. Hikers noticed clothing snagged on branches. Fishermen saw something pale beneath the surface. Police responded as they often do to such discoveries, cautiously, procedurally, without yet grasping that they were standing at the edge of something far larger than an isolated crime. The early calls came in quietly, filtered through dispatch like routine disturbances. What they did not yet know was that the river had begun to speak, and it would not stop. The first victims were young women, their remains showing signs of strangulation. This detail at first blended into investigative uncertainty rather than clarity. Strangulation was common in intimate crimes, often associated with domestic disputes. Police considered the possibility of multiple unrelated attacks. The bodies had been in the water long enough to obscure small details, and Washington's damp environment accelerated decay, complicating timelines. Each case arrived fragmented, carrying just enough information to raise concern, but not enough to draw firm conclusions. The connective tissue between these deaths was still invisible to those handling them. As more remains surfaced, the similarities became harder to dismiss. The victims shared physical characteristics. They were found in the same general region. Their deaths showed the same quiet violence, hands pressing, air cut off, bodies abandoned without ceremony. The river, winding through forested banks and industrial outskirts, began to serve as an unintentional ledger, a place where lives ended and were partially erased. Yet even then, language lagged behind reality. Authorities spoke cautiously. Possible pattern, ongoing investigation, words chosen to avoid alarm, unknowingly buying time for the man responsible. Gary Ridgway watched all of this from a distance that felt safe because it was ordinary. He listened to the radio. He read newspapers. He watched television coverage with the same detached attention one might give to a faraway storm. He was careful not to engage too directly, not to comment excessively at work or home. When others expressed concern, he nodded quietly. When news anchors warned women to be cautious near the river, he absorbed that information and adjusted, not in fear, but in calculation. Every public response became data. Every press statement helped him refine his routine. The Green River Task Force was formed under mounting pressure as evidence accumulated. Detectives from multiple jurisdictions came together, sharing limited information across imperfect channels. The region had never dealt with a serial killer on this scale, and protocols were still evolving. Without modern DNA analysis capable of linking cases definitively, investigators relied on witness statements, timelines, and behavioral profiling that, while advancing, remained imprecise. Early suspects came and went, often dismissed due to lack of evidence or because their lives appeared too stable to conceal something so monstrous. Stability, as it turned out, was exactly what protected Ridgway. For families of the missing, the shift from uncertainty to terror was agonizing. Mothers who had been told their daughters likely ran away now watched news segments confirming bodies found where their children were last seen. Each discovery reopened wounds, not just of grief, but of guilt. Many wondered what they could have done differently, forgetting that systems larger than any family had failed. Posters once stapled desperately to telephone poles fluttered in rain until the ink ran. Names faded. Faces blurred. But the hope that someone somewhere would bring their daughters home remained painfully intact. Ridgway understood this emotional landscape intuitively. He selected victims whose absence would produce the least institutional noise. He knew that early investigations focused more on family contexts than on patterns among vulnerable populations. When sex workers disappeared, their circles were often transient, fractured, or fearful of police involvement. This delay in reporting created empty space, time enough for evidence to degrade, for bodies to move unpredictably, for attention to drift. The river did not give up its secrets easily. What distinguished Ridgway from many killers was not innovation, but repetition. He repeated methods because they worked. He strangled because strangulation left limited forensic evidence. He used the river because water disrupted timelines and destroyed trace materials. He placed bodies in groups because he returned to familiar dumping sites, not because he wanted to send a message. If symbolism existed, it was incidental. Efficiency mattered more. He was not crafting spectacle. He was maintaining process. As the number of victims climbed into the dozens, tension spread unevenly across the region. Public fear remained compartmentalized, much like Ridgway's own psyche. Suburban neighborhoods discussed safety in abstract terms. Women warned each other quietly. Law enforcement increased patrols in targeted areas, but resources were finite, and visibility was inconsistent. Many nights passed silently. And on those nights, Ridgway sometimes drove without killing, simply observing. He had learned to wait. He had learned that stagnation could be as useful as action. Detectives began interviewing men known to frequent areas near Pacific Highway South, including Ridgway. He submitted samples. He took tests. He passed. Polygraphs, now known to be unreliable and skilled liars or emotionally subdued individuals, reinforced a false sense of certainty. Ridgway did not exhibit stress in the way examiners expected. He did not break under questioning. He answered directly, politely, without contradiction. His ordinariness insulated him better than deception alone ever could. The river continued yielding bodies, not all at once, but steadily enough to prevent closure. Each discovery carried echoes of those before it. Sometimes articles would mention a dumping ground or a pattern, but without names, patterns remain abstractions. Ridgway took advantage of that abstraction. He shifted sites occasionally, changed routes, modified behaviors just enough to disrupt continuity without abandoning familiarity. This careful calibration kept him ahead of the investigation, not through intelligence so much as restraint. Inside the task force, frustration mounted. Leads produced suspects who could not be placed at scenes. Witness descriptions contradicted one another. Timelines overlapped inconsistently. It was as though the killer existed outside ordinary tracking mechanisms, drifting between jurisdictions like vapor. In reality, he lived in a fixed location, worked a repetitive job, and followed routines that never changed. But those routines were invisible because no one thought to examine them. Attention was pointed outward toward anomalies rather than inward toward the shape of normal life repeated day after day. Then there were the moments when discovery made proximity unavoidable. Officers walked along banks they had previously overlooked. They stood beneath bridges near industrial zones they had passed countless times. The familiarity of these places unsettled them. The idea that bodies had been placed where anyone might walk their dog or fish on a weekend pierced illusions of safety. But familiarity also bred denial. Surely someone would have noticed. Surely something would have stood out earlier. This belief delayed recognition that the killer was not an outsider intruding into the region, but someone already embedded within it. Ridgway's response to each body discovered was clinical. He would stop using a site temporarily. He would change small habits. Then he would continue. Fear for him was secondary. What motivated him was internal pressure and release. a cycle sustained by secrecy and reinforced by survival. He did not seek escalation as spectacle. He sought consistency that allowed his life to remain intact. As the media's focus intensified, so did misunderstandings about the killer's personality. Many assumed he would be chaotic, socially isolated, or visibly unstable. Ridgway was none of those things. He attended work meetings. He discussed sports. He argued with spouses. He lived a life so unremarkable it actively repelled curiosity. This misalignment between expectation and reality allowed him to remain invisible, even as the river revealed more of his history. By the time investigators fully acknowledged the scale of the killings, the damage was already profound. Dozens of women had been murdered, many unidentified. Families waited in limbo, sometimes for years. The task force had become overwhelmed by information without clarity, drowning in data as surely as the river obscured physical evidence. Every day that passed without resolution strengthened the illusion that the killer might never be caught. And yet, beneath that illusion, cracks were forming. New technologies loomed on the horizon. Patterns, though faint, persisted. Ridgway's name appeared in files more than once, flagged and then set aside. The river had begun its slow work of revelation, not all at once, but persistently. Each body forced the region to confront the possibility that the man responsible was closer than anyone wanted to believe. Long before the investigation had a name, before task forces and press conferences and grim statistics, there were simply absences. Chairs left empty at kitchen tables. Phone calls that went unanswered. Beds that remained slept in only on one side. The Green River killings did not begin in the public consciousness, with bodies pulled from water or bones discovered in the woods. They began with silence, the quiet, unsettling disappearance of women whose lives were already lived on the edges of attention. This silence would become the most powerful shield Gary Ridgway ever had. Many of the women who vanished in the early 1980s lived transient lives by necessity. Some had run from abusive homes or broken foster systems. Others struggled with addiction or mental illness. Some were young, some older, but nearly all shared the same dangerous quality in the eyes of society. They were easy to dismiss. When they disappeared, the first assumption was rarely violence. Instead, families were told their daughters had likely moved on, relapsed, or chosen a different path. Police reports were delayed or discouraged. The absence of urgency stretched time thin, allowing trails to go cold before they were even acknowledged. Gary Ridgway was acutely aware of this. His choice of victims was not random, nor was it motivated solely by opportunity. It was informed by observation, by a grim understanding of whose lives triggered alarms and whose quietly slipped through the cracks. He noticed which missing posters stayed up longer, which ones were ignored, which faces never appeared on the evening news. These patterns reinforced his strategy. He learned that disappearance itself could act as camouflage, that time was not the enemy in these cases, but an accomplice. Families who did search for their missing loved ones encountered systems that struggled to respond. Jurisdictions were fragmented. Records were incomplete. Many women were last seen moving through multiple cities or counties in short spans of time. Without a fixed residence, tracking movement proved nearly impossible. Each missing person existed as a data point disconnected from the others, handled separately, without context. Ridgway exploited this fragmentation fully, leaving behind not a clear trail, but dozens of broken threads no one initially knew how to tie together. The emotional toll on families was devastating in slow motion. Parents waited for weeks, then months, clinging to small signs of life. A reported sighting. A rumor passed from one neighborhood to another. someone who thought they recognized a face near a bus station. Every false lead reopened hope only to collapse it again. For many, the eventual discovery that their daughter or sister had been murdered near the Green River came not as shock, but as confirmation of a fear they had carried for years. The absence had already taught them grief. The bodies simply gave it a name. Meanwhile, Ridgway continued living inside the comfort of routine. Each disappearance reinforced his confidence. He learned that bodies caused attention, but missing people caused delay, and delay allowed him to regulate his behavior. During periods when pressure increased, he reduced activity. When intensity faded, he resumed. This ebb and flow gave his crimes a rhythm that mirrored the investigation's own cycles of urgency and stall. He did not experience the disappearances as tragedies unfolding behind him. To him, they were proof of system failure, a confirmation that his choices were effective. Throughout this period, law enforcement faced unrelenting pressure from the growing list of missing women. Officers worked long hours, revisiting sites, canvassing neighborhoods, re-interviewing individuals already cleared. But without reliable forensic connections, the investigation remained reactive rather than predictive. New cases drew attention away from older ones. Resources were stretched thin. The scope of the problem felt overwhelming, almost abstract. Detectives later described the sensation of drowning in names without faces, files without answers. Ridgway's continued invisibility was strengthened by the way society framed both the victims and the threat. Much of the coverage implied that danger existed only within specific lifestyles, subtly reassuring others that they were safe. This narrative was comforting, but false. It allowed many to believe the risk did not apply to them or their families. And it allowed Ridgway, who looked thoroughly ordinary, to pass unnoticed in grocery lines and traffic. As time passed, the missing women became more than individual cases. They became symbols of neglect. Lists grew longer, some names were misspelled, some records lacked photographs, some files simply vanished. Each administrative failure compounded the harm. Severing vital links between cases, Ridgway thrived in these gaps. His life remained unexamined not because of exceptional brilliance, but because no one expected him to be the sort of man who could maintain such violence alongside a stable routine. There were moments when truth came dangerously close to the surface. Witnesses described a quiet man picking up women repeatedly. Tips were called in. Ridgway's name surfaced again and again within the task force. But each time, without a decisive link, it drifted back into obscurity. Investigators followed rules that demanded certainty, evidence beyond suspicion. And Ridgway, aware of how close lines were drawn, operated just beyond them. He took advantage not of corruption, but of procedural caution. The missing women haunted the region in subtle ways. Street populations shifted. Women began moving in pairs or avoiding certain areas. Trust eroded quietly. Fear did not manifest as panic, but as vigilance, a scanning of faces, a tightening of routines. But vigilance without power only changes behavior. It does not protect against someone who waits patiently and appears harmless. Ridgway understood this asymmetry perfectly. When some families pressed harder, demanding attention, their advocacy forced limited progress. More task force funding, more visibility, more long-term pressure. But even then, the focus remained split: bodies found versus women missing. It would take years before investigators fully grasped that disappearances themselves were the strongest evidence, that absence was the primary crime scene. For Ridgway, each missing woman was not just a victim, but further insulation. The longer someone went unreported, the more difficult it became to reconstruct their final moments. He relied on that erosion of clarity. He relied on memory fading, details blurring. He understood that society moves on quickly, especially when victims are marginalized. And in that understanding, he found both permission and protection. By the mid-1980s, the Green River Killer investigation had entered a strange and exhausting phase, one defined less by discovery than by endurance. The early shock had faded, replaced by a grinding sense of uncertainty. Bodies were still found occasionally, but not in the rapid succession that had first suggested an unstoppable threat. For the public, fear softened into something more diffused, an awareness that danger existed somewhere out there, but without immediacy or clarity. For law enforcement, the case had become a monument to frustration, a puzzle that refused to resolve itself no matter how many hours were poured into it. And for Gary Ridgway, this period marked a crucial evolution. He did not panic under scrutiny. He did not escalate recklessly. He learned to wait. Waiting for Ridgway was not inactivity. It was strategy. The increased police presence along Pacific Highway South forced him to pull back, but it did not extinguish his compulsion. Instead, he learned how to redirect it. He paid close attention to patterns in patrol schedules, to media cycles, to the way public attention rose and fell. He noticed that after every spike of discovery and coverage, there came a lull. Officers moved on to other priorities. Resources were reassigned. Fear receded just enough for routines to resume. In those quiet troughs between alarms, Ridgway operated with calculated restraint. This ability to pause distinguished him from countless others who were driven by uncontrollable impulses. Ridgway's violence was not explosive or dramatic. It was integrated into his emotional regulation. When pressure inside him built, he didn't immediately act. He observed. He waited until circumstances aligned, until a night felt familiar, until the absence of attention created space. This patience allowed him to survive scrutiny in ways that confounded investigators who expected escalation under pressure. His life during these years outwardly appeared calmer than at any point since the killings began. He married again. He maintained steady employment. He attended church regularly, reinforcing his image as a quiet, compliant man. Within religious spaces, confession and forgiveness offered him psychological relief without demanding accountability. Prayer became a ritual bookend to violence, a way for him to reduce guilt while preserving behavior. This internal logic was deeply distorted, but it functioned consistently. Ridgway believed he could compartmentalize sin in ways that did not require change. Behind this facade of normalcy, Ridgway refined his routines further. He reduced contact with areas under heavy surveillance. He moved dumping sites deeper into wooded areas or to locations already associated with prior discoveries, exploiting the assumption that newly found remains belonged to older cases. He selected victims cautiously, sometimes going long stretches without killing at all. These gaps later confused timelines and caused investigators to underestimate the duration of his activity. What looked like a decline was not remorse or reform. It was recalibration. Detectives working the case experienced profound exhaustion during this period. Leads multiplied without convergence. New tips contradicted old ones. Suspects were ruled out, then reconsidered, then ruled out again. The task force became a rotating door of effort, with members burning out or reassigned. Without technological breakthroughs, the investigation relied heavily on behavioral profiling, witness recollection, and intuition. None of these were enough. The killer's endurance outpaced institutional stamina. Ridgway himself was interviewed multiple times, his name appearing in investigative files repeatedly like a faint watermark. Each time, he presented himself as cooperative, almost eager to help. He passed polygraph examinations. He consented to searches that uncovered nothing. His calm demeanor disarmed suspicion. In the eyes of many investigators, he was simply too ordinary, too controlled, too boring to be capable of such sustained brutality. This bias, the expectation that danger announces itself, worked relentlessly in his favor. During these quieter years, Ridgway's killings did not cease entirely. Instead, they became more sporadic and more controlled. Some victims were lured farther from urban corridors. Some were killed indoors in ways that left fewer traces. He learned which mistakes increased risk and eliminated them. Murder for him had become an operation to be optimized, not a frenzy to be indulged. This operational thinking is one of the most chilling aspects of his psychology. Violence was no longer just an emotional release. It was an activity governed by feedback and adaptation. The families of missing women, meanwhile, lived in extended limbo. For those whose loved ones never appeared among recovered remains, uncertainty became permanent. Parents aged. Siblings moved forward with fractured hope. Without bodies, funerals felt inappropriate. Without confirmation, closure remained impossible. The psychological damage of not knowing proved as devastating as loss itself. Ridgway's waiting multiplied this suffering, stretching grief across years rather than moments. As the case aged, political support waned. Funding ebbed and flowed. New crimes elsewhere redirected attention. This was not indifference so much as institutional triage or recognition that resources were finite and demands endless. Ridgway benefited from every competing priority. Every year without headlines reduced urgency. Every new tragedy shifted focus. The illusion formed that perhaps the killer had stopped, moved on, or died. That illusion proved dangerously comforting. Ridgway's patience also extended to his own emotional world. He learned to suppress urges when timing felt wrong, storing resentment like fuel. His internal monologue during this period reveals little anguish or conflict. He did not struggle against violent thoughts. He simply scheduled them for later. This deferred gratification granted him stability at the cost of ongoing harm. It allowed him to maintain relationships and routines that gave him cover. Religion continued to play a role in this balancing act. Ridgway later described moments when he believed he was fighting temptation, when prayer temporarily calmed him. But these interludes did not produce abstinence. They produced intervals. And intervals were enough. Unlike killers driven to escalation by compulsion or fantasy collapse, Ridgway did not need constant intensity. His needs could be met intermittently, allowing him to re-enter civilian life unnoticed. Law enforcement, operating under outdated assumptions, underestimated this capacity. Many serial killer profiles predicted increasing recklessness or eventual self-destructs. Ridgway defied these models. He did not seek publicity. He did not need attention. He needed opportunity. By avoiding drama, he remained invisible. The very qualities that made him seem safe, reliability, predictability, emotional flatness, were the same ones that sustained his crimes. In the background, however, something was changing quietly but irrevocably. Advances in forensic science were inching forward. DNA analysis, once experimental, was becoming more reliable. Evidence that had been collected years earlier was preserved, stored away like dormant seeds waiting for technology to catch up. Ridgway did not anticipate this shift. He believed evidence degraded permanently. He believed time erased accountability. He was wrong. At the same time, investigators began revisiting old cases with new eyes. Patterns that once seemed coincidental gained weight when viewed across decades. Names reappeared. Ridgway's file grew thicker, harder to dismiss completely. Patience, which had protected him for so long, was beginning to betray him. The systems he had outlasted were slowly evolving, exchanging speed for precision, explosiveness for persistence. By the late 1990s, the Green River investigation had settled into an uneasy half-life. It was never officially closed, never fully abandoned, but it no longer dominated headlines or nightly news. For many in law enforcement, it existed like an open wound that had scarred over without healing, visible, painful when pressed, but no longer bleeding openly. For Gary Ridgway, this prolonged stillness reinforced an idea that had grown quietly inside him for years, that he had succeeded. Time, he believed, had done what cunning alone could not. The world had moved on, and with every passing season, his confidence that he would never face consequences solidified. What Ridgway could not perceive from inside his carefully compartmentalized life was that the nature of pursuit had changed. Investigators were no longer relying solely on interviews, tip lines, and behavioral analysis. Instead, they were revisiting preserved evidence with tools that hadn't existed when bodies were first pulled from the riverbanks. Advances in DNA technology, slow, expensive, methodical, were beginning to rewrite the rules of cold cases across the country. The Green River files, heavy with collected samples once deemed inconclusive, were quietly reopened. This shift did not announce itself dramatically. There were no raids, no sudden confrontations. Instead, technicians re-examined threads of evidence stored for decades of fibers, saliva traces, small biological remnants that had survived water, soil, and time. Each sample was processed carefully, cautiously, often producing partial profiles at first. But even partial matches could narrow fields once considered impossibly broad. In this new landscape, patience became a liability rather than a strength. Ridgway's years of waiting had not erased his imprint. They had preserved it. Law enforcement attention returned to individuals who had once orbited the investigation without consequence. Gary Ridgway's name, already familiar in the files, rose again, not because of new behavior, but because of old proximity. He lived near dumping sites. He had been known to frequent Pacific Highway South. He had previously failed to stand out just enough to escape sustained scrutiny. Now, investigators reconsidered those earlier assumptions under a different lens. Familiarity began to look less like innocence and more like access. In 2001, this renewed scrutiny reached a critical point. Detectives obtained a DNA sample from Ridgway quietly, legally, without spectacle. When the results began aligning with evidence from several known victims, the decades-long illusion of safety collapsed in an instant. The confirmation was not emotional. It was clinical. Numbers and markers matched across cases spanning years. The precision of the technology cut through ambiguity that had protected Ridgway since the beginning. For the first time, patience failed him completely. His arrest did not resemble the dramatic takedown many might expect from such a notorious case. There were no chases, no violent resistance. Ridgway submitted calmly. To those present, he appeared almost relieved, as though the burden of concealment had finally lifted. The arrest marked the end of his physical freedom, but it also triggered a psychological transition that would fundamentally reshape the case. For the first time, Ridgway began to talk. Confession did not come as a flood, nor did it arrive with remorse. It unfolded slowly, methodically, in fragments that mirrored the structure of his crimes. Ridgway spoke in practical terms, often describing actions without emotional descriptors. He used names when prompted, locations when asked, and withheld information when it suited him. His demeanor unsettled investigators not because it was hostile, but because it was disturbingly cooperative. He had moved from hiding to participation with unsettling ease. Faith remained an element of his internal narrative throughout this period. Ridgway spoke openly about religion, about prayer, about his belief that God had forgiven him even before the legal system had judged him. He described praying over victims' bodies, seeking absolution after killing rather than restraint before it. This inversion of faith confused and disturbed many who listened. To Ridgway, confession to God did not require behavioral transformation. Forgiveness, in his mind, was separate from accountability. He could be absolved spiritually while continuing materially. This belief system played a role in how he approached cooperation with police. Ridgway did not view confession as surrender. He viewed it as transaction. He offered answers in exchange for control over outcomes, reduced sentencing, avoidance of the death penalty, and the preservation of a life he still believed had meaning. The investigators, acutely aware that many victims' remains remained undiscovered, faced an ethical matrix of their own. Each piece of information he gave could bring closure to families. Each concession offered reinforced his leverage. The confession process stretched across months, sometimes years. Ridgway led detectives to scenes that had long faded into the environment, wooded areas reclaimed by growth, riverbanks altered by erosion, construction zones layered over graves. Sometimes he struggled to remember specific locations. Other times, he recalled routes and landmarks with unsettling clarity. The passage of time had softened neither his memory nor his detachment. Murder, for him, remained procedural recollection, devoid of personal narrative. Families of victims watched this phase with mixed emotions. For some, learning details about their loved ones' final moments brought long-denied clarity. For others, the revelations reopened trauma they had fought to contain. The knowledge that a man could describe killing so calmly unsettled assumptions about human nature itself. Ridgway did not fit the image of chaos or madness they had constructed to make the violence bearable. He was too ordinary, too deliberate. His cooperation revealed the staggering scale of his crimes. Numbers increased as he confessed to dozens more murders than initially confirmed. Some claims could be verified. Others could not. Investigators struggled to reconcile maps of known remains with Ridgway's admissions. The possibility that some victims would never be identified lingered heavily. His willingness to talk did not guarantee completeness. Control remained central to his behavior even in confession. Throughout interrogations, Ridgway rarely expressed empathy in recognizable terms. When he did articulate emotion, it tended to focus inward. Stress alleviated, pressure released, temptation resisted temporarily. Victims appeared not as people but as variables within his experience. This framing reinforced forensic psychologists' conclusions. Ridgway did not kill for thrill or notoriety. He killed to manage internal states he had never learned to regulate otherwise. As legal proceedings progressed, prosecutors weighed the immense burden of a trial that could stretch 4 years against the unprecedented opportunity to recover remains and secure finality. The decision to pursue a plea deal was not made lightly. It involved exhaustive consultation with families, law enforcement, and legal experts. Each choice exposed philosophical tensions between justice and closure, punishment and information. Ridgway's acceptance of a plea agreement underscored the transactional logic that had guided him throughout his crimes. He avoided the death penalty. In return, he provided further cooperation. The courtroom scenes that followed were subdued, not theatrical. Without protest or visible remorse, Ridgway accepted multiple life sentences. His posture suggested resolution rather than defeat. Control, even at the end, had been preserved where possible. Segment 6 ends at this threshold: confession without catharsis, closure without peace. Gary Ridgway, who had spent years mastering the art of waiting, is finally undone by time itself. DNA silent, patient, Precise succeeds where fear, profiling, and persistence alone had failed. Faith, twisted into justification, accompanies him even as chains replace disguises. And the river, which once concealed so much, becomes merely a witness to history rather than an accomplice. What remains are answers incomplete, graves unmarked, and questions about how many lives slipped through before consequence arrived. Ridgway's waiting is finally over. But for the families, the reckoning is just beginning. When the discussion turned from investigation to resolution, the atmosphere surrounding the Green River case shifted in a way few involved had anticipated. After decades of unanswered questions, bodies found without names, and families lingering in suspended grief, the arrest of Gary Ridgway should have felt like a decisive victory. Instead, it opened a new chapter, one defined not by certainty, but by moral complexity. The question facing prosecutors was no longer simply how to punish a killer. It was how to balance justice with truth, retribution with recovery, and public expectation with the private needs of families who had waited far too long for answers. The legal reality was stark. Ridgway faced overwhelming evidence tied to multiple murders. DNA placed him at scenes no amount of denial could erase. A traditional trial could have secured the death penalty, satisfying public demand for the severest punishment available. But a trial would take years of appeals, years of hearings, years in which many victims' remains would remain hidden, buried in forests and riverbanks only Ridgway could identify. The prosecution realized that the strongest leverage they had over him was not the threat of death alone, but the promise of containment, life without freedom, combined with the opportunity to extract information that would otherwise be lost forever. Ridgway understood this leverage immediately. He had survived by reading systems and adjusting behavior accordingly, and the legal system was merely one more environment to navigate. His willingness to cooperate was not sudden repentance. It was continuity. Cooperation allowed him to shape the final narrative of his life, preserving a sense of agency even as control slipped away. The idea of a plea deal appealed not because it absolved him, but because it formalized his role as an active participant rather than a silent object of punishment. For families of victims, the proposal of a plea deal felt like betrayal to some and relief to others. Decades of imagining justice in stark terms had hardened expectations. Many had pictured closure as finality, a public trial, a verdict, perhaps even execution. But reality offered no such simplicity. Meetings were held in quiet rooms where prosecutors explained trade-offs, acknowledging openly that some answers would only come through negotiation. The burden placed on survivors was extraordinary. To decide whether reduced punishment for a killer was acceptable if it meant locating remains, returning names to faces, and ending years of limbo. Some families supported the deal immediately. They wanted their daughters home, even if only in burial. They wanted certainty instead of myth. Others resisted, feeling that any concession to Ridgway granted him something he did not deserve. These divisions were painful but understandable. Grief does not operate uniformly. Justice does not heal all wounds equally. And the system was asking families to weigh abstract punishment against tangible closure. Behind closed doors, prosecutors worked methodically, line by line, constructing an agreement that would hold up legally and ethically. Ridgway would plead guilty to multiple counts of aggravated murder. In exchange, he would receive life imprisonment without the possibility of parole instead of facing execution. Crucially, he would be required to cooperate fully with investigators, disclosing information about victims, locations, and circumstances to the extent of his memory. The deal's success depended on verification. His statements could not remain uncorroborated. Each confession had to be matched with physical evidence or credible corroboration. His words alone were insufficient. Ridgway entered this phase with the same unsettling calm observers had noted since his arrest. He did not express anger at the deal, nor desperation. He asked logistical questions. He requested clarity. He accepted conditions with minimal hesitation. During hearings, his demeanor appeared reserved, controlled, almost relaxed. For a man whose life had been defined by secret violence, the structure of a plea agreement offered predictability. The chaos of a trial gave way to a regulated process. In that, he found comfort. When Ridgway spoke in court, his voice remained even. He answered when prompted. He acknowledged guilt without emotional display. For many watching, the lack of visible remorse was jarring. There was no breakdown, no dramatic confession. He described acts as facts, not narratives. Names, dates, locations, that was enough. Some found this infuriating. Others found it clarifying. The absence of performance stripped the moment of illusion. This was not catharsis. It was transaction. As the plea agreement unfolded, law enforcement teams prepared to revisit sites long abandoned by memory and terrain. Ridgway's directions were sometimes precise, sometimes vague. Landscapes had changed. Forests reclaimed ground. Roads were rerouted. Yet piece by piece, the past resurfaced. Bones, clothing, personal effects emerged from places once thought emptied by time. Each discovery was a mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief that someone was finally found. Sorrow that the truth took so long to reach daylight. Families were notified carefully, deliberately. Some learned the fate of their loved ones after 20 years or more. For them, the plea deal delivered something trials often fail to provide: specificity. Knowing where a daughter lay, how she died, and that her suffering was finally acknowledged allowed grief to settle into something more stable. Pain did not vanish, but uncertainty did. For others, the revelations brought renewed trauma. No amount of preparation could soften hearing details spoken calmly by the man responsible. Public reaction remained divided. Headlines questioned whether the plea was too lenient. Commentators argued over principle versus outcome. The death penalty loomed large in these debates, symbolizing closure for some and futility for others. What often went unspoken was the irreversible reality that execution would have silenced Ridgway permanently, along with every answer still locked in his memory. The plea deal, imperfect as it was, traded symbolic justice for practical truth. Throughout this process, Ridgway continued framing his cooperation through the lens of faith. He spoke of forgiveness, of spiritual reckoning separate from law. This language frustrated many, as it seemed to grant him moral relief without consequence. But in evaluating the plea, prosecutors focused not on his beliefs, but on outcomes. Each confirmed location validated the agreement. Each returned name justified the compromise, at least in part. When the court formally accepted the plea, sentencing followed swiftly. Ridgway was sentenced to multiple life terms without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would never re-enter society. The courtroom scenes lacked drama. There was no audience spectacle, no closing speech meant to summarize decades of loss. Instead, there was only process, quiet, procedural, relentless. Justice here did not arrive as thunder. It arrived as paperwork. The true weight of the plea deal settled gradually over time. As searches continued and records were updated, the scale of Ridgway's crimes became clearer. Numbers rose. Names were added. But some gaps remained. Some victims could not be located. Some identities were never recovered. The agreement could not undo everything, could not restore completeness. It could only reduce uncertainty where possible. Ridgway entered prison as he had entered every stage of his life. Quietly, he did not rebel or dramatize confinement. For him, routine replaced routine, cells replaced vehicles, schedules replaced opportunities. The absence of freedom registered less dramatically than the absence of secrecy, yet even behind bars, elements of control remained. He participated selectively. He spoke when advantageous. Silence, once a shield, became optional. After the courtrooms emptied, and the cameras moved on, after transcripts were filed away, and evidence returned to storage, what remained was not the satisfying silence people often expect to follow justice. The conclusion of the Green River case did not feel like an ending so much as a long exhale after decades of holding breath. Gary Ridgway was incarcerated, sentenced to life without parole, his name permanently attached to one of the largest collections of murder victims in American history. But even as the legal chapter closed, the emotional and cultural impact of what had unfolded lingered, diffuse and unresolved. This was not a story that could be finished neatly. Rivers do not stop flowing simply because their secrets have been uncovered. For the families of Ridgway's victims, life after the case looked very different depending on what answers they received. Some were finally able to bury their daughters or sisters, to mark a place in the ground where grief could settle for them. The discovery of remains, however painful, provided a form of stability that had been missing for decades. Knowing when and where their loved ones died allowed time to progress again, to move forward rather than circle the same unanswered questions endlessly. Others were not so fortunate. Some victims were never found. Some identities were never confirmed. Some families remain suspended in uncertainty, their grief still without a physical anchor. The plea deal had limits, and those limits remain a quiet source of resentment and sorrow. The Green River, now burdened with its history, continues to pass through neighborhoods, forests, and industrial zones without visible awareness of what it once concealed. People walk dogs near its banks, jog along paths, fish in its waters. New generations grow up unaware of the horror embedded in familiar landscapes. This forgetting is not malicious, it is human. Spaces eventually reclaim their neutrality, even when violence wants to find them. But memory persists in subtle ways, in plaques, in conversations, in moments when the water seems darker than it should. Law enforcement agencies involved in the case underwent their own reckoning. The Green River investigation reshaped how missing persons cases were treated, particularly those involving marginalized populations. It exposed the dangers of delayed reporting, fragmented jurisdiction, and societal bias in determining whose lives warranted urgency. In hindsight, the failures are clear. In real time, they were multiplied by limited resources, outdated technology, and assumptions that violence announces itself loudly. The case helped push policy shifts emphasizing early intervention, centralized databases, and improved forensic preservation. These changes did not restore lost lives, but they altered trajectories for future investigations. Gary Ridgway himself became an object of study rather than fear. In prison, he settled into a predictable routine, offering little drama, rarely speaking publicly. Psychologists and criminologists analyzed his behavior, searching for explanations that might render his crimes comprehensible. What many found unsettling was not complexity, but simplicity. Ridgway was not driven by brilliance or madness in the way popular culture imagines serial killers. He was driven by habits formed early, sustained by anonymity, and reinforced by systems slow to respond. His crimes thrived not on chaos, but on consistency. The narrative surrounding him shifted slowly over time. Early portrayals emphasized monstrosity and necessary framing to contain fear. Later analyses lean toward banality, toward the idea that extraordinary harm can stem from ordinary lives under specific conditions. This refrain was deeply uncomfortable. It suggested that safety does not come from spotting villains, but from strengthening systems and recognizing quiet patterns before bodies accumulate. Ridgway was not an intruder from outside society. He was embedded within it, indistinguishable until evidence forced recognition. The Green River Killer case also forced a difficult conversation about memory and numbers. Estimates of Ridgway's victims vary. Confessions exceed recoveries. Maps contain gaps, some believe. The true total will never be known. This uncertainty complicates narratives of legacy and scale. Does the exact number matter more than the reality that dozens of women were murdered and discarded for families? Each number represents a life, not a statistic. The inability to account for everyone leaves a wound that documentation cannot fully heal. Time, however, continues its quiet work. New technologies surface. Old evidence is revisited. Occasionally, another identity is confirmed through advancements unforeseen at the time of sentencing. Each confirmation ripples outward, stirring memory and grief long settled into stillness. The story does not re-enter headlines often, but it resurfaces in these smaller, quieter ways, reminding those involved that resolution is not final, it is iterative. Culturally, the Green River case altered perceptions of danger in subtle but lasting ways. It challenged assumptions about stranger danger versus familiarity. It exposed the fragility of safety when invisibility shields harm. It underscored how violence is often enabled not by malice alone, but by neglect, normalization, and delay. For those who lived through the era, the case remains a reference point, a reminder of what happens when disappearances are treated as lifestyle choices rather than emergencies. The river's role in this story remains symbolic and unresolved. It functioned as both hiding place and accidental witness, carrying traces downstream while revealing others unpredictably. It reminds us that landscapes absorb human actions whether acknowledged or not. Long after perpetrators are imprisoned or gone, environments retain echoes of what occurred within them. The Green River will always carry that burden, even as it supports life and movement in the present. Ridgway's name now exists primarily in files, textbooks, and archives. He no longer moves through highways or factory floors. His routines are constrained, monitored, diminished, yet even imprisoned, his impact persists. Survivors dream. Families revisit memories. Communities remember in fragments. Justice, delivered slowly and unevenly, continues reshaping understanding long after formal procedures end.